G'day guys, welcome back to Just the Tips for round 8 of the 2025 AFL season. Last week went a lot better for myself and I suspect many others. I managed to get 8 correct tips with Carlton ruining my tips, which would have been a perfect 9 had they not got the job done. So a great win by them, and 8 out of 9 puts me at about 112th in the competition of over 1,000 people, which you can still join. We've got a fantasy competition and a tipping competition in the description below. Just click those links. So before we get into round 8, we will shout out the weekly winners. The best tipper this round was someone called Gab. I can't read the whole name for some reason on my phone. With 9 correct tips and a margin of 3. That is outstanding tipping. The tipping leader is someone called Chloe. Again, I can't see the full name, but well done, Chloe. With 49 correct tips for this year and a margin of 132. That's outstanding. And the fantasy leader is now averaging over 2,000 points per game, and that is Lachlan H. So well done, Lachlan. I had a pretty shocking round of fantasy, and I've just given up on that. But hey, it's fun to take part nonetheless. Now, round 8 definitely has some doozies in there, but I do suspect there may not be a whole lot of variance in between what people do this week. So without further ado, let's get into it. So it kicks off with Essendon versus North Melbourne. Historically, a bit of a rivalry game between these two sides. Now, Essendon coming off a loss against Collingwood at Anzac Day, they sit 3-3, and North Melbourne with a much improved performance against the Power at Adelaide Oval in a fiery contest, no doubt. A couple of suspensions, probably one of the most talked about games of the round. But North Melbourne almost made me look silly for not tipping them, and I was, with all due respect to them, I was kind of hoping they didn't win because I tipped them against Sydney, I tipped them against Carlton, and I was an absolute idiot for those tips. Didn't tip them against the Power, and sure enough, they pull out a very strong performance, and it was quite impressive. Now, can they back it up in a game that is, with all due respect to Essendon, a lot more winnable on paper, you'd think, than the Power at Adelaide Oval? So if North Melbourne can bring that form into this game, Essendon could be a little vulnerable here. I had a look. Essendon have beaten North Melbourne 11 times in a row. You have to go back to 2016 for the last time that North Melbourne actually beat the Bombers, albeit there has been some close games. I feel like maybe last year, or maybe it was the year before, there was a couple of close games between these two sides in a period where North Melbourne hasn't been great. So, look, this is winnable, and I certainly, don't want to write North Melbourne off here, but I think Essendon has been somewhat reliable this year. When I say reliable, they've just they've beaten the teams you'd more or less expect them to beat. And they haven't had a real stinker yet, in my opinion. So, I think both of these sides will come to play in a game that is, obviously winnable for both of them. I know that's redundant, but Essendon will see this as an opportunity to push back closer to the 8. North Melbourne, a chance for a rare win. So I'm going to say Essendon will hold on for a 10-point win, but I definitely think there's a chance of an upset here. St Kilda versus Fremantle is another interesting one because in my memory, and I'm glad I looked it up, I thought that St Kilda had a better record against Fremantle than they do, particularly at Marvel. But it's just that in the last 4, there's been 2 wins each way. St Kilda beat Fremantle in 2022 when Fremantle made the finals. That game was in Perth, which actually makes it more impressive. Other than that, Fremantle have won 2 of the last 3 at Marvel, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So I usually consider, does one team have a habit of beating the other at a certain ground? And I don't think that really applies here. So we're really just talking about which team is going to be better on the day. Fremantle were much improved against the Adelaide Crows. That was a good win. And, they were criticised a lot for being, lacking a killer mindset against Melbourne. I don't know if that's entirely fair, but they backed it up with a much improved performance against the Crows, who are a good side this year. St Kilda, on the other hand, got beaten by the reigning premiers at Marvel. So again, not too much to go off in terms of that performance in isolation. Look, Fremantle is the better team. I think St Kilda's form this year has been, at times, quite compelling. And, they beat Port, and Port's been all over the place this year. That was a good win, and at that point I thought maybe this is the year for St Kilda, but a couple of poor losses at least since then, and they sit with a percentage of 85. That's crazy. Look, I think Fremantle is good enough to win this game. Are they likely to let slip 2 Melbourne trips that are very winnable in a row? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say Fremantle carry in their better form and they beat St Kilda by 22 points. The Bulldogs and Port Adelaide at Mars in Ballarat is, again, another interesting one. It's such an easy thing to say about a game, but this one is interesting because 2 sides that had at various points been a little shaky this year, but have also looked like, a real powerhouse at times this season, coming up against each other at a time where I don't know who is in the better form. So the Bulldogs are coming off a really big win against the Giants in Sydney, which I did tip, but I didn't think they'd win so comprehensively. And Bontempelli back into that side, well, he makes a big difference, doesn't he? It's not just based on his form, absolutely. Liberatore is another one that has been fantastic all year. So Look, there's a lot of positive form here for the Dogs. It's not a true home game. By the same token, the Power have looked much improved, since that St Kilda game that I just referenced there. They've had a win in Sydney. They beat North on the weekend. They had a big win over Hawthorn too. So it's very hard to split these two teams in terms of the form line and who is actually better. And again, it's not a true home game. And I suppose the Bulldogs are more experienced at Ballarat. I don't think these sides have met at Ballarat, or if they have, it wasn't for a long time. It may even be the first time they've met there. So there's just purely an almost neutral venue, 9th versus 10th on the ladder, both teams in red hot form, both teams with a really strong midfield. This is a genuine toss-up for me. It really is. And I think I'm just going to go with the Dogs purely, probably just because of the fact that they have a little bit more experience playing at this ground. If it was Adelaide Oval, I'd probably swing it the other way. So that's probably my conservative tip. I'll say the Bulldogs by 9 points. But this for me is game of the round. Adelaide versus Carlton. Now, the Crows started this season red hot and have subsequently fallen away a little bit. They sit with 4 wins and 3 losses. And off the top of my head, is that 3 in a row that they've lost? Not sure if it's in a row, but the most recent loss was against Fremantle at Optus Stadium, which can be a tricky ground to beat Fremantle at. Absolutely. They're a good side at home, generally speaking. So did we go early on the Crows? Are they simply in a form slump? That remains to be seen. Carlton went from being, their season being over to looking red hot again, not just because they smashed up on a couple of easy teams, but subsequently beat the Cats last week at the MCG, showing real character. And, I was wondering this, actually. I was like, would Carlton necessarily have beaten Geelong in round 5, let's say, if they'd played, if they hadn't had a bit of a tune-up against West Coast and North Melbourne? It's an interesting one to consider. I'm not taking anything away from them, but it almost seems like they needed that couple of weeks there against pretty weak opposition to gain some confidence back, and that certainly looked like it was the case against the Cats on the weekend. So that's a big scalp. They've beaten the Cats, who have beaten the Crows at Adelaide Oval. However, the recent history would suggest that the Adelaide Crows love playing Carlton at Adelaide Oval, and I can't remember if it was a gather-round game, but back in 2023, they absolutely walloped them there. They also beat them at Marvel last year, if I'm not mistaken. I think they beat them by 2 points. So Adelaide do have a bit of a history of beating Carlton. So regardless of form lines, I'm actually going to tip against the form line here and say that Adelaide will expose Carlton and win this game by 24 points and get a little bit more momentum back into their season. But it's not to say Carlton's, completely out of it at 3 and 5. We know that they can be a good team. Collingwood versus the Cats. Is there any chance this is a grand final preview? We're a bit early for those kind of discussions at the moment, but two sides that I expect will go deep in 2025, or at least, be in the finals in week 2 and beyond. So, look, Collingwood sit top of the ladder. Another win against the Essendon Footy Club on Anzac Day. Not too much fuss since their first opening round loss against the Giants. And the Cats have looked a little bit shaky. At times, they've looked outstanding, and other times they've looked vulnerable. There's a recent win against Hawthorn, which was great. There was a loss to Carlton more recently than that. Then there was also that loss against the Brisbane Lions, where they got 5 goals up and not capitulated maybe, but they certainly got run over the top of. So it has been a bit up and down for the Cats, and it makes me nervous backing them in for this game. I said the Bulldogs versus Port Adelaide might be game of the round. This could also be a very, very compelling contender to be game of the round, and there's a lot of intrigue about it. I think most people are tipping Collingwood based on the data you can see on the Footy Tipping app. It tells you the percentages, and I think Collingwood are pretty big favourites. I wonder if that would be the case if Geelong hadn't just lost to Carlton. But for me personally, that doesn't make me any less confident that Cats will come out and play a good game in this game, because they generally are a big game team. That all being said, I don't think Collingwood has done anything since opening round to make me feel like they are not going to come to play in this game. And I think, once again, I'm going to have to go conservative here and tip Collingwood by 20 points. It's not often that West Coast games come with a bit of intrigue, but this one probably does. Maybe it's just because I'm an Eagles fan, but naturally we're wondering when West Coast will get their first win. And in fairness to West Coast, who have been pretty poor this year, it has been a tough run of fixtures. So I would say that this is West Coast's second winnable game of the year against the Melbourne Football Club. Now, how winnable is it for West Coast? Well, the fact of the matter is, Melbourne, after starting the year 0-5, have won 2 games on the bounce. Now, the most recent one was against Richmond, who at times have played really good footy, and I wish my team was playing as good as Richmond, but equally will be a bit inconsistent. The week before that, Melbourne were red hot against Fremantle. They really played well. and to a standard I don't think West Coast has in their kit bag at the moment, even at their best. So that one's a tough one. When you look at these teams on paper, there's a very clear favourite here. So to what extent is Melbourne able to pull out a strong performance here? Their vulnerability will be if West Coast senses a rare chance for a win, like they did against Essendon, and get the jump. And if West Coast get the jump and hold it naturally, that gives them a chance of winning. But West Coast would need to start well in this game. I don't think West Coast is without their chances, but I think the strength of Melbourne and the fact that in the last fortnight they've been able to build some belief and confidence, which West Coast is still trying to seek out. Despite how it went last time Melbourne played West Coast at Optus, where West Coast had a big win, I just can't do it. I honestly just cannot tip West Coast here. I'm going to be there and hope for the best, but my brain says Melbourne win this by, let's call it 25 points, and I just hope we play well. Sydney and the Giants at the SCG. Again, this would have looked like a potential grand final preview at the start of the year, depending on your viewpoint, obviously, but two sides we expected to be strong contenders this year. Now, Sydney sit 15th with a record of 2-5, and in particular, it was a strange performance against the Gold Coast Suns to get 5 goals in front and then concede 12 in a row. So the Swans are looking vulnerable. Their percentage is still 94.6, which is interesting. I think they did have a few tough fixtures at the start of the year and, of course, have been dealing with injuries. But in the context of this game, they don't look anywhere near the standard of the Giants so far, even considering the Giants were well beaten by the Bulldogs at their home deck last week by 7 goals. Sorry, that's the second time I've said that game was in Sydney. It was actually in Monaco, wasn't it? It is a Sydney home game. I had a quick look at the head-to-head, and the Giants don't play badly at the SCG, but I think more often than not, the Swans have got them there in a period where both sides have been pretty strong. So this one's a tough one. The Giants, I think, should win this game, to be honest. I mean, both sides are talented. It's not really a question of talent. I think Sydney has great talent, even if, they're structurally a little bit exposed and, that hasn't really been a problem for them in the past. Their injuries do make a difference here. But look, I mean, it really comes down to what extent Sydney come out and try and make a statement after a pretty disappointing loss against the Suns. I mean, certainly the way they fell away badly. But on the other hand, they got 5 goals in front, and that is not an easy thing to do at Gold Coast home ground this year. So all that being said, I think I'm going to tip the Giants because I think they just give me a little more confidence in them to come out and perform well. It won't be a big win. I reckon it'll be a thriller. Let's say 5 points to the Giants. Hawthorn versus Richmond. Hawthorn played West Coast last week, and I thought that West Coast were a little bit more competitive than other games this year, and at times made things a little bit tricky for Hawthorn, but they're such a talented side that it would be wrong to suggest West Coast really challenged them. So I think Hawthorn, over the last handful of weeks haven't been at their absolute best, but they're playing Richmond who, are up and down. And Richmond's 2 wins this year have been impressive. They were great against Carlton, as we all remember, I'm sure. And they were quite good against the Gold Coast Suns. The senior players stood up, their talls got to work, and their pressure was great. So I think they're going to continue to be an inconsistent side, naturally. So it's just like, is this the week that Richmond play well? It's at the MCG. I don't think it's going to matter. I think Hawthorn are too far ahead of Richmond and don't look too vulnerable to, scrappy sides trying to pull them down to their level. As we saw last week where they, were far too good for West Coast. Richmond is better than West Coast, but Hawthorn will win this by a comfortable, I'll say 45. The Queensland Derby, or whatever the hell they call it these days. What did they call it before? The Q Clash? Is it still that? Who cares? Brisbane versus Gold Coast. Now this, I say who cares facetiously, this is actually a really big game, and I do care about the outcome, because the Gold Coast Suns sit 5-1, save for a disappointing loss against the Richmond Footy Club. They haven't put much of a foot wrong this year, and like I just talked about, demoralised Sydney with 12 goals in a row last week. So I do think the Gold Coast Suns are the real deal. It depends whether they can hold on for an entire season with, a lot of players, not quite in their prime. From memory, they haven't beaten Brisbane since Brisbane's been good. I think you have to go back to 2018 for the last time the Gold Coast Suns have beaten the Lions at the Gabba specifically. But this is a much better side than we've ever seen the Gold Coast Suns roll out with. So I don't think that is a foregone conclusion that they won't beat them this time. The Lions, a professional performance against St Kilda, save for, a pretty poor home loss against Collingwood, they have also looked pretty good. I mean, I have talked about this before. They have had issues playing 4 quarters, and that was why I thought they were vulnerable against the Pies. But, I think maybe they've had their shock, and I don't really have concerns about them in this game. So this is just a game between 2 good sides, and honestly, it's probably the best Q Clash in terms of anticipation we've ever seen. Hopefully, certainly the standard must be better. So, with all that being said, who's going to win? I think that the Suns can win, but I think at the Gabba, the Brisbane Lions surely are the safe tip here. Now, I did see, I think 88% of people tip the Brisbane Lions on the footy tipping app that we use on ESPN, and I don't think that represents the level of favouritism here. I think it's kind of 55-45 or maybe 60-40 at a push. Probably 55-45. So I will say on that note, the Brisbane Lions will win a tight game by, let's go, 11 points. All right, that is the round concluded. So as we look at the top four, we've got Collingwood, Brisbane, and Hawthorn back into third after a couple of easy wins against Richmond and West Coast, presumably, and the Gold Coast Suns hanging on to fourth despite having played one less game. Adelaide back up into fifth. The Giants, the Bulldogs, and Fremantle making up the rest of the eight. I was about to say that is the, pretty much a correct top eight, but then Geelong and Port Adelaide have also looked pretty good this year. So I feel like those top 10 teams are genuine finalist quality sides at this current point in time. Not sure about Essendon, and who knows about Carlton. St Kilda, Melbourne, Sydney, and Richmond make up the next four, and we have North Melbourne and West Coast taking their familiar seats at the bottom of the ladder. Sydney in 15th, definitely. That could change. I expect that to change. But have they left their run late for finals? They absolutely have. 2 and 6 is definitely pushing it. Albeit they do have players to come back. And who knows, I might even be wrong about their tip. They could beat the Giants this week and, really get their season back on track. But as always, guys, I look forward to your comments and let me know who you tip this week. Game of the round, well, like I said, Bulldogs or Port, Collingwood or Geelong, also a worthy nomination. Upset of the round, probably North Melbourne and Essendon. Or West Coast and Melbourne. I've just, picked the two bottom teams there. But both of them are playing sort of winnable games, even if I said that Melbourne should be too good for West Coast. So let me know what you think, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.